Thanks, Rebecca. Hello, everyone. Dissecting the impact of voice quality on customer satisfaction and retention. Boy, is that a mouthful. But instead of really, talking about that and dissecting the title itself, I just want to jump in with a story from my own life. Recently, I called my bank, and let me tell you, it was not a pleasant experience. And it had nothing to do with the actions of the person on the other end, any of the things that they went through, what they were telling me about my bank account. It was entirely due to the quality of the call. We couldn't understand each other. I couldn't hear her. That was the problem. And so we went through sort of standard things. We checked out a headset. I made sure that the position of the headset on my ear was right. And she checked to make sure that she was holding her phone correctly. We, checked cables, all connected everywhere, and then we're sort of left with nothing. Now, this particular experience came out all right because I happen to be a communications engineer, and so I had some advanced technology on my side that allowed me to fix the problem. But most customers aren't me. The reality is that if you have bad voice quality to one of your users, you're going to end up with a poor customer experience. And we all spend a lot of time today talking about customer experience and how we can guarantee it, how we can ensure that we're providing good customer experience. But one of the most basic things that we have to consider is that people have to be understood to have a good customer experience. If they can't hear you or you can't hear them, there's no good customer experience to be had anywhere. And as we are more and more interacting on the phone, online, because of current conditions in the world, we have to consider that this is an absolutely critical issue to address. So let's spend some time talking about it. We're going to talk about how we can look at voice quality and measure it, what it is. We can then talk about the ways we can address it, and we'll dive into three particular areas: infrastructure, monitoring, and procedure. If we've gotten through all of that, we'll have some time left at the end. If I've timed this correctly, we'll make sure and take your questions. So as I go along, as Rebecca said, if you mouse over to the lower left-hand corner, the control bar for the conference will pop up, and you'll see a little chat icon. At any time, you can pop a message in there. If you're like me, if you wait till the end, you'll never remember what your question was in the first place. So this gives you a chance to put the question there just as you think of it, and we'll make sure and address all those questions and any others you think of at the end. So let's get into it. Let's first talk about how to measure voice quality. And the first part about that is there already a scale for this? And the good news is, of course there is. We've already come up with something. It's called the Mean Opinion Score, or MOS score. A MOS score is rated 1 to 5, and anything from around 3.5 to 3.8, depending on who you ask, up is going to be a good call. Voice over IP, which is what we're all using, even if you think you're not using voice over IP, trust me, about 3 seconds after the call leaves your system, it's going voice over IP on the carrier system. So voice over IP is what everyone's calls are nowadays, and those generally rank in the 3.5 to 4.2. Now, this has a lot of things that sound very subjective in the characteristics here, but this is very, very specifically measured by computer systems today, and we can tell it very specifically. So what goes into making a good or bad call? Well, the first thing is the codec used. There's a number of different codecs, and these are just the way we take the voice that's going into the phone or the headset and transmit it and turn it into data so that we can send it across the wire. There are three main codecs to think about today. G722 is high definition audio. Theoretically, this should be the best you can get and sounds really great. One of the problems with G722 is it requires every single part of the conversation to have G722 for it to provide benefit. So if your other endpoint, your customer, doesn't have this capability, it's not going to necessarily help. G711 is what we consider voice quality. It's what you would get on an old school phone system with no voice over IP. You're going to get G711, and we have the same codec and use the same capability on voice over IP connections today. And then if you're looking at really highly compressed conversations where bandwidth is an issue, you've got G729. And a reason I say highly compressed is the difference between the three of these is absolutely the amount of data they use. The difference between G722 and G711 isn't really that huge, but the difference between G711 and G729 absolutely is. G729 calls can take somewhere between 20 and 30 kilobits of data per second, which isn't a lot, while a voice quality call can take somewhere around 100 kilobits. So you can fit 5 calls of the G729 type in the same space as one G711 call. That's a huge difference. And so G729 is very commonly used, but it does provide problems because it's not going to be as good voice quality for the various things it does. So that's one of the first things that affects things. What codec are you using? Does this mean you should always use G711 or G722? Not necessarily. I know some very large retail organizations that are doing millions of calls that use G729 very successfully, and they're very happy with the measured voice quality they get out of it. It really depends on a lot of other things as well. So let's look at some of those. The next one is packet loss. This is how much data is lost in transit, how much never gets from point A to point B. We like to think that, oh, it all gets there, but that's just not the case. If you have packet loss, you're going to get drops in audio. People are going to lose words or bits of words, and that starts to make it hard to understand them. The next one is latency. The packets show up, the data shows up from point A to point E, but it gets there late. And one of the key parts about this is voice is a real-time medium. It doesn't really help you if the first word of the sentence shows up at the end of the sentence. That's going to cause problems. So this is going to cause delay, and you're going to have things slow down. And it can cause, if you've ever heard a high-speed audio where there's a delay, and all of a sudden everything speeds up. That's actually the system trying to catch up with a latency problem. And then there's jitter. Jitter is intermittent delays. So some data shows up on time, some shows up late, and jitter can be the worst because there's a point where you have to forget about the data, you try and use it, you can end up with garbled audio, and this can cause some of the worst problems. It is a combination of packet loss and latency, but it's doing it in uncertain amounts. Sometimes it's perfectly fine, sometimes things are showing up late, and that's possibly the worst. And then the last thing that can affect your voice quality is going to be echo. So if you all of a sudden start hearing a person talk twice and hear the same thing twice, and this is usually driven by the device itself, not so much something to do with the path. Everything else here we've been talking about is the network path and the transmission of the information from point A to point B. This is just the device that's at point A or point B that's really causing this problem. So those are the main different pieces that are going to cause things. So how can we deal with these? How can we address these problems? Well, there are 3 major ways that we're going to be talking about here today to address voice quality. The first is infrastructure, the second is monitoring, and the third is through procedure. What do I mean by that? Well, infrastructure is all the stuff you do ahead of time, right? It's network connections. It's the wide area network that may connect all of your stores to your central data centers. It's the phones, headsets, or devices that are on the desks of the users. It's the phone system or the cloud system that you're using, because we'll be talking about both a premise solution and cloud solution as we go through this. A lot of the stuff is the same, and we'll point out where there are differences. But all of this is stuff that you prep ahead of time. And hopefully you're spending a lot of focus here, because this is what you can do to prevent stuff proactively. You can build all of this infrastructure correctly. You can spend a lot of time on it. We'll dive into this a little more. The second thing that we would talk about is monitoring. And monitoring is what we can do to make sure that there aren't problems and to know about them so that we can react to them and we can fix them. This includes things like getting reports from every single call in the system. This includes having a central monitoring system itself, a database that records all of this so we can go back at and look at problems, and tools for providing proactive responses, for seeing things early and fixing them early on. So all of these roll into a monitoring solution. But then there's the third thing. What do we do about stuff that we find both with monitoring as well as that gets reported by individuals? So procedure allows us to deal with that. These are things that we write down ahead of time and figure out actions that the individuals can take, processes that we can take to improve call quality at the system level, and how we report problems. And we'll go through all of those as well. So let's talk about each of these individually and understand how they can impact voice quality. So first, let's talk about infrastructure. There's a lot that can be done on infrastructure. In fact, I've done entire webinars specifically on this topic. This is something we can dive deep into, but I'm going to cover this at a very high level. So the first thing is, what is the network that you're talking about? And I'll start out with MPLS, because this is the most common network people have deployed out there today. MPLS happens to stand for Multi-Protocol Labeling System. And the value of MPLS is it's provided by the data carrier that's providing your internet connections and your data connections. So they're going to use this to guarantee, and generally it comes with an SLA, a service level agreement, that says, hey, this is what we're going to provide for you, and this is the quality of service. And that's something that you can feel a little better about, because you've got a guarantee from somebody else that this is all going to work. The way MPLS helps out is that, like I said, it's multi-protocol labeling system. It's all about putting a label on all of the data that you send and receive across that network. And that label prioritizes that packet ahead of other stuff. So somebody may just be checking out IMDb to figure out the name of that guy who was in that movie one time. Well, your phone call is more important than that. And MPLS makes sure that that is prioritized across the network. Now, the thing about MPLS is that it is technically a networking technology for your wide area network. It's meant to connect your data center to your store, to your corporate offices. It doesn't connect to the internet itself. If you do that, and many people do it this way, what you'll have is you'll have a big pipe at a central location, for example, your data center. And then all of the network connections from all of your other locations, all of your stores, for example, route all the way back to the data center, and then they go out that network connection. So you have essentially a star or technology, a hub and spoke technology, where to get internet connectivity, that location must be able to get back to the center of it, the data center. So that's one of those things to understand about MPLS, is it doesn't actually offer internet access. It doesn't offer phone access either. You have to route through something else. And the other piece about this is MPLS is expensive. It is not a cheap solution. And one that I probably should have put on here is it's not necessarily available everywhere. And you have to find all the locations from a single carrier, which makes it really hard to deploy, because if you have a location that's not covered by your carrier, then you can't get MPLS there, and you start having to look at more complex solutions. So the new contender to the throne is what we call SD-WAN, or Software-Defined Wide Area Networking. That's almost as big a mouthful as the title of this presentation. So SD-WAN just uses multiple cheaper internet connections. You can put a couple of different internet connections in your store. The SD-WAN has a device that then uses software to use both of those connections and prioritize traffic onto one connection or another. If one connection fails, you'll use the other connection automatically. Nobody has to do anything. But even more importantly, if one connection sucks, if there's terrible bandwidth and you're having all those problems we talked about earlier, latency, jitter, all of that kind of stuff, then the SD-WAN connection will automatically prioritize and use the other connection for you. Now, the great thing about this can be used anywhere you can get any kind of internet connection. It can use anything pretty much. You can plug it in. It's a much lower cost than MPLS, but there's no actual guarantee going on here. The SD-WAN provider may say, hey, look, I'll provide a guarantee, but the service itself isn't guaranteed. It's just using multiple different links and allowing you to push across which one works. However, having said that and cautioned you on that, I will tell you that using multiple different links ends up in providing a very highly reliable. In fact, Nemerti's research says it's even more reliable than your standard MPLS connection when you do it right. If you want to know how to do it right, Vertical can help with that. And then another piece of this is cell failover. This is very, very popular. We've seen out there in the retail market of using cellular data to provide backup. And you can have a cell failover gateway that will provide the store location with connectivity, and it can automatically fail over when you've got something like an SD-WAN device, for example, that does this. In fact, there are SD-WAN devices that have a cell modem built right in to use as one of those multiple internet links. And the great part about this is that at this point, LTE coverage, which is our common high-speed internet technology on cellular today, LTE coverage is really good over the United States today. It doesn't cover everywhere still, but it's probably the best high-speed internet connectivity coverage in the entire country. So this is a great option to put in to maybe pair with a single wired connection on an SD-WAN circuit, and you can have failover to cell failover. one of the questions I often get when I talk about this is, well, Kevin, can this really handle voice? And the answer is, of course it can, because the cell phones are using it for voice. Cell voice nowadays is pretty much voice over IP. So if you have any concerns or qualms, that's what the cell carriers are using to deliver your voice. They have some special tricks of their own, but I have no concerns or whatsoever about using cell failover to provide voice capability. The last thing I want to talk about is the phone device. You need to have a quality device here. We'll talk in more depth in just a moment on this, but it has to be something that is a high quality piece of equipment, because it can cause problems of its own. If you just give somebody a $15 headset that you got at the corner kiosk, that's not the same thing as a $100 headset from Plantronics that has a lot of additional technology built into them that may not be obvious for providing a good sounding call. And the other piece about this is you want something that can provide MOS score data back to your central monitoring system. We will also talk about that a little more, but it's important to have a device that does that. So I want to take a moment on infrastructure to talk about remote workers. So even in the retail space, this is applicable. You may have people who in your contact center, other people who are now at home, as so many of us are. And we like to think, oh, everybody's got a perfect workspace, they've got a dedicated desk, all like this nice woman. But let's be honest. A lot of our remote workers today have this. They're sitting on a couch, they're trying to take care of kids, they've got dogs barking in a common room because they don't have the space to have a separate dedicated workspace. And I just point that out as something to think about, because all of this does impact the customer experience. All of it impacts what that individual worker can deliver. And they don't have really any choice. Unless you're going to buy them a better house, this is what they've got. So think about that as you're thinking about those remote workers and how they work through this. A couple of things that you can immediately do is the company should own the hardware. I talked a moment ago about some of the things that are involved here. If you're worried about the customer experience, you've got to be the one that provides the hardware. Now, the good news is if you have a voice over IP system, especially a cloud system, you can go ahead and take the phone that that worker may have been using in a corporate location, whether it's a call center, the corporate office, or even somebody who's coming from the store that's just going to be handling calls. That person can take that phone home as long as you have the proper inventory controls, and you get a lot out of that. A quality device should provide high quality calling, the ability to use multiple different codecs, and to be able to do a good job of providing the audio. It should provide the MOS reporting back to the central system and should have the capability to do that. It should provide what we call audio fencing. Audio fencing is the ability to identify what's the primary speaking voice on the call and mask out everything in the background. I was literally talking with Rebecca, who started off this call earlier yesterday, on a call, and Rebecca was all of a sudden apologizing about her dogs. And I'm like, I don't hear any dogs. I just hear you talking. That's audio fencing at work. When you think, oh my gosh, my kid's screaming in the other room, audio fencing is the technology that can mask that out by identifying what the primary speaker is and eliminating all the background noise. And quality devices, both on the phone and headset, can have this, especially from certain vendors, and we can talk about that more. And then last but not least, echo cancellation. I mentioned that echo is almost entirely a focus of the device. That's why you've got to have echo cancellation that is good and built into the device. If you've got a problem with echo cancellation, it is almost certainly the phone or headset that's doing it. The other key thing is the worker internet. This is the key factor in call quality. If your worker doesn't have a good connection and they're a remote worker, there's no chance. Your customer experience is going to be terrible every single time. So you may want to get involved in what that internet connection is if you're going to have people working at home for quite a while, which we all are right now. May want to think about, is it worthwhile to have them have a backup internet connection to allow them to upgrade to a better internet connection, or potentially even put in an SD-WAN device, which can cost somewhere between $100 and $150 a month to manage and provide them with better service. That's one of those decisions that you have to look at, and if the cost outweighs the customer experience. But this piece of it is one of those things where, to be honest, we're in a country where there ain't great internet connections available everywhere in the country. We have to deal with that and understand it's now become the business's problem when we have at-home workers. So these are the few things that are going to affect voice quality just from the level of infrastructure to think about. So let's move on for a moment and talk about monitoring. Monitoring is being able to tell what's going on and have the information to see when there are problems. So monitoring basically looks at 4 parts. It starts with the user's phone or headset, and then it looks at the phone system, whether that's a cloud solution up in the cloud, or it's the you have a premise-based system located somewhere in a data center or a primary location. There's a call carrier. That's whoever's providing your connectivity out to the rest of the phone network. That could be a Verizon or an AT&T, something like that. It might be your cloud provider. If you're using a cloud solution, they're probably your call carrier as well. And then that gets all the way to the last mile to the customer's phone, whether that's their mobile device, as it is with so many people, a desk phone in an office, or whatever it is. Those are the 4 main sections. And really what you want to do here is you're monitoring not the devices themselves, but the connections between them. The path from the user phone back to the phone system, the path from the phone system out to the call carrier, the path from the call carrier to the customer phone. These are all the pieces that you're really monitoring, because as I mentioned at the beginning, all the problems are really in the transport, the transit from location to location, except for the phone problems themselves, the echo, and that's something that's really device oriented. Now, one limitation I'll point out is you don't really have a way to manage this section. You can't monitor it. You can't see it. This is going to be pretty transparent to you unless you're talking to somebody who's inside the network. It's a user-to-user call. You're not going to be able to see this. So when talking about monitoring, we start with the phones in this, and our phones need to support 2 major protocols. These are standard protocols out there, RFC 6035 and RFC 3611. RFC 6035 basically, at the end of each call, sends a roll-up report that says, hey, here's my report card on that call. Here's how good it was. Here's what it sounded like. RFC 3611 are ongoing call quality metrics that go out every few seconds saying, here's what I see in both directions and see what's happening and how good the call quality is. And so you want phones that support both of these. The good news is Vertical supports a number of different phone types that all provide this for you. So we have Vertical phones that provide this. We have Poly phones, as well as phones from Mitel. So whatever solution you're working with Vertical on today, or are talking about working with us, we have solutions that support these industry standards. Even if you already have an older Vertical solution, maybe you have a solution that isn't voice over IP, it's still for example, a Vertical Wave IP with what we call analog or TDM digital phones. You have those. The good news is those devices can report out from their location back across a voice over IP connection, and they can do this kind of reporting instead. So you don't have to worry about it being at the phones. It can be at the phone system itself as you're connecting various locations together. But you've got to have support for all of these things. The next piece are probes. It's always a fun word. Probes are inserted at key points in your network. They provide data about what's going on at a router location, at a location where you're bridging network connectivity together. If you have a phone system, that phone system then has a connection to the outside world, you'd want to probe between those two. If you have routing points where calls are coming together at a local point of presence and then routing back to a central data center, you'd want to probe there. And these probes are software or hardware devices that monitor all the network data. They snoop on all the network data and use it to provide information on what's going on. And they report back to your central monitoring platform. Hey, that gives us the central monitoring platform. This monitoring platform is going to provide a collector that receives phone and probe reports. It's going to get all that information and collect it all. And this is where the phones report everything. The phones don't have much intelligence, but they can send out a report to a location and say, oh, hey, here's what I know about my calls. And all the probes do that. And then it collects all of them and assembles them into an end-to-end picture, stores all of that in a historical database. So if you had a problem 3 weeks ago, you can go back and still look at it. And then provides analytics to transform this into usable reports. So you're not trying to figure out, oh, this probe and this phone call and this connection here were all together. You don't have to do that. The system does it for you. And it provides it in a reasonable user interface so that you can quickly evaluate call quality, see the problems, and understand what's going on. This is the part that should do all of the key work for you and make it easy for you to understand what's happening. There's an example there of one solution that Vertical offers that provides all of this and puts it into a nice, digestible format. So there are some differences here between cloud and premise. So let's talk about those for a moment. On the premise side, you need to deploy the voice quality monitoring solution yourself. You can have a single system that can handle all your store locations, whether those store locations have, their own individual phone systems like waves all over the place, for example, which we do with customers, or they just have phones that are reporting back to a central system in the data center. Either one, the voice quality monitoring system can monitor all of them locations. You have one system. You'll then need to figure out and work with Vertical on figuring out where you need to deploy probes to get the full end-to-end call spectrum on the parts that you can monitor. You've got to make sure all your phones are licensed for voice quality monitoring because, as I said before, all these phones we sell, they all support this. But in many cases, there may be a separate license to make them turn on and do this. Because if you haven't had a voice quality monitoring system previously, there was no reason for you to pay for the phones to be able to do this. And then you'll have a great system that you can use. It will be highly customizable to your needs. You can put it together to meet what your requirements are. If you have various geographical regions that you focus on and have different reporting pieces, you can build those into the system. They can be broken up into groups where you have different teams looking at different parts of the country. You can have specific reports that meet your requirements. You can do everything you want because that's one of the advantages of owning the system. I will mention by the way, to do this, it's very helpful if you haven't already moved to this to do centralized trunking, to no longer just have the connections in the stores, because if you do that, you're probably going to have a probe in addition to the phones in the stores, or you will want to look at centralized trunking just for the cost advantages of it alone. This is something we can talk to you about if you haven't done. But centralized trunking will be very helpful because then you can have a centralized probe that's reporting what's going on at the very edge of your network. So that's what the premise side looks like. On the cloud side, it's very different. This should be included in the cloud solution. If you're looking at a cloud solution or you have one today and they do not have voice quality monitoring and you can't get access to it, then I would run away very, very quickly. This is just, you've got to have this. It can report on phones anywhere is one of the good things. You can put the phones at your house, you can move users home, just as we talked about, and you can still get reports on them. One of the shortcomings here is you're going to have less visibility on some of the legs because they'll cross the public internet. If you have that remote user sitting at home, they're reporting to a cloud server, in California or DC or something like that. You're not going to have as much visibility to the possible problems. So that is a shortcoming with the cloud piece. The other part about this that's different is there should be monitoring of this offered by the cloud vendor as part of the as a service. When we talk about unified communications as a service, when we talk about cloud, that's part of the name that we forget sometimes. And you should be getting monitoring. There should be an active team looking at all this and noting when there are problems and proactively responding to it. Because the thing about a cloud solution is a big part of the infrastructure that on the premise side, you're installing probes and you own and you're doing the design and all this. You don't own any of that. That's owned by the cloud vendor. It's in their data centers, and it's something that you've got to hand off to them. The other part about this is even though somebody else is doing all that work and should be taking care of that and doing that, and that's bread and butter of the cloud solution, you should still have access to the information as well. If you don't, like I said, I would run away very quickly because that information gives you accountability where you can turn around and be able to solve the problems at your last mile with your end users. It also gives you the ability to go back to the cloud vendor and say, hold on a second, there's a problem here. I've got the stats. Tell me what's going on. And especially if you have any kind of service level agreement with them, this is the data that will allow you to enforce it. So you need to have access to this. If you don't, I would be very, very concerned. So this is monitoring. It gives you all this access to the data. It lets you see what's going on and it shows up in these nice crunchy reports that you can look at. But none of it means anything unless you have a way to do something with it. And that's where we get to our next part, which is procedures. And we have 3 different types of procedures here. We talk about recurring procedures, reactive procedures, and I tried to come up with an R for the third one, but I got individual. Sorry. So it's not as great as I wanted it to be there. But each of these are important. You're doing this ahead of time. You're building procedures before the problems happen so that you can go through this and know what you're doing. You probably have tons of procedures already, but let's talk about the ones you need to do with voice quality monitoring and to make sure that you have a great voice call every single time. The first is you should be regularly reviewing trends, looking for problems, and digging in. Your solution should be able to make this easy for you. You ought to have the data right there where, for example, here I can see locations, I can see time of day, I can see MOS scores really quickly up the top. You can see I can see the excellent, the good, the fair, and the poor. I got one poor call. I can very quickly spot problems. For example, Winder here has a lot of poor calls. Now I might dig into it and discover what I'm seeing here is that Winder had 2 calls and one of them was poor, and that's why this looks this way. But this is where you want to be looking into this and looking for trends. Yes, the system should proactively send you alerts when there are problems, but you need to own this responsibility as well. Someone needs to be checking in on a regular basis, probably several times a day, just to look and see if there are trends where there are individual sites that are having problems, that there are problems during a specific time of day is another common trend to look for. If you see a specific user that's having consistent problems, you need to look for these things and be able to spot the trends before the end user is even reporting them to you, because then you can solve it before it becomes a real problem. And that's the ideal, right? So definitely one of your recurring procedures needs to be a process for looking at these trends and spotting the problem and then going after how you're going to fix it. A next part of this, and this is much more specifically to the premise side, is active testing. Not just waiting for problems, but using your probes and the agents out there to send test data back and forth and make sure that there are no problems. There's a number of things that you can get out of this. You can look at all the components of the network, things like DHCP and DNS. You can make sure that your SIP path is working correctly. There are 2 different parts to any voice over IP call generally. There's the signaling portion that sets up the call and does things like features. And then there's the media stream, which is actually the audio going back and forth. And these 2 can get out of sync. You might have one that works great, but the other one doesn't. And all of a sudden you have silence on the line, either in both directions or only in one direction. Those kind of things can happen. And it's terrible when they happen with an actual customer. So active testing can make sure that you identify this ahead of time. Now, as I mentioned, this is very premise-oriented. If you've got a premise system, you're going to want to be scheduling the active testing. If it's a cloud solution, the cloud team should be doing this regularly, and they should be making sure that there's no problems. That's something that's on them. If they're not, that's a real concern and something that you should be worried about. Another recurring procedure to look at is getting information back from your store locations. You need to have a regular process to check for problems. You can integrate this into a regular store reporting, just add it as a line item on the daily or weekly reports they provide. It provides subjective feedback saying, oh yes, the store is doing well, there's not. You can compare it to your data that are in your big nifty centralized reporting reports that says, hey, all the calls are great, but everybody at store 116 says they're terrible. There's obviously a disconnect here. We need to dig into it. Might turn out it has nothing to do with the transport of the system itself. It might turn out that there's just too much noise in the store, or maybe there's line noise in the store. You really need to have this subjective piece. I will tell you of a story that we had many, many years ago with a retailer that does plumbing supplies in the Northeast. And they kept on telling us that they had a problem where there was a noise on the line. And all of our reporting said things were great. We started recording calls from that location. They sounded awesome. And then we found out that there was a specific bug that was going on in the software between the user's handpiece and the phone system locally that we never even saw anywhere. It was on the very edge. And by putting somebody on site and listening to the subjective experience that we were being told there was a problem, we were able to actually capture it and discover something that was not measurable or traceable at all. So this has to be a check on the whole system, and it needs to be included into your process for guaranteeing voice quality. Ask the question. And I would also, you'll see here that I suggest that to the extent that you're surveying customers, and one of the problems we have out there is we're probably surveying customers too much, or we're getting survey fatigue. I realize that. But as the extent you can add this on to existing, not making it a separate thing, check with people to make sure that the call sounded good, that they're not having problems. Because that's another that's the other end of it, to pick out whether or not the customer experience is good. A classic fact that's been around for a number of years, but I think is really always valuable to listen to, is Harvard Business Review did a survey of call quality experience a number of years ago. It's about 2014. And what they determined was 80% of the business said things were great. 8% of the customers said things were great. That's a little bit of a disconnect. So include the customers in your surveying process. So after recurring procedures, we want to talk about reactive procedures. And this is absolutely where you need to plan ahead of time. One of my favorite quotes: it's too late to come up with a plan when it's all going wrong. Plan ahead of time. If these guys don't have a plan, they're in real trouble. So here's some of the things you should be putting into your reaction plan. First, you need to train diagnosis and troubleshooting ahead of time. You need to sit down and have a process for having your people who are in your technical team, or you need to have the experts that you're counting on, people like Vertical, know how to do diagnosis and troubleshooting ahead of time so they can figure out the problem and know the steps they would take to fix it. They can't just wait and wing it. You need to have a checklist for this diagnosis process. Vertical can help with that, but here's some of the things that we normally put. Look for those trends once again. Immediately look to your monitoring source and look, is it not just the one call that was reported? Is the whole location having problems? Is there a problem on a specific leg of your network? Is there a problem in the customer area, which leads to maybe this isn't your issue at all, it's an external issue, so it's a customer side problem. That doesn't mean that you can just say, oh, not our problem, too bad. You still got to come up with ways to address it, but you'll know that it's a carrier issue, there's an outage somewhere. I think just a few days ago, we had a massive outage that hit a bunch of people in the area all over the country, and that's a problem that you still have to put into case. But you don't want to be trying to troubleshoot your network when it's an external problem. You want to figure out how you're going to solve that. You need to isolate down to the specific problem area so that you can start focusing on it. And then you also want to review sample calls and use the data within your monitoring system, which can start to show you where the problem may be. Good reporting will show you things like packet loss, jitter, latency, all the things we talked about, and you can start to narrow down to what the specific problem is. I also want to put a very important caveat. It's great to have automated systems, things like SD-WAN that automatically switch networks and move things around, but they may not be adequate to solve the problem. You've got to plan for manual intervention. A perfect discussion of this was last year, there was a massive outage that took out about a third of the internet worldwide that could be traced to what was at the time CenturyLink, now Lumen, and they had a problem. And in the end, the problem was determined that their automated system for dealing with problems was causing the problem. Their routers kept on dumping their load, rebooting, loading up the same problem automated system that had provided them with the wrong routing instructions over and over and over again. And secondary carriers that were connected to CenturyLink's networks had systems that were doing something similar where they quit dumping CenturyLink's connections, but then retrying, and it was the automated systems that were really made the problem as bad as it was. So automated systems are great, but have a plan for manual intervention because they might even be the cause of the problem. And then with a cloud solution, you need to be able to have access to the information as we talked about before, but also you've got to know who to contact and how to escalate. You've got to have that information clearly to hand ahead of time so that you're not scrambling for it when the problem actually occurs. Let's finish up by talking about that individual. Let's not forget about that customer we started with. This isn't what I actually look like, right? It's just a piece of clip art. But let's imagine this is me, right? And I'm upset because the call quality is terrible. We need to have processes to help this. So you want to develop troubleshooting procedures for the individual users. Some of the ideas that I would suggest: check equipment. Make sure they're looking for things as simple as where their microphone is. The number of times when I found that the problem on the other end of the line is the person has their microphone on a headset flipped up so that their microphone is pointed to the forehead, and all of a sudden they sound like they're 20 miles away. It's silly, but that's something that should be on a checklist to check. Where's your microphone located? Check the cable connections. How is it plugged in? If you're using a handset, make sure that the handset is firmly plugged in. Make sure that they're not using speakerphone. Make sure that they're on the handset itself. And then another option, and this may sound silly, but it's a very real thing, is to reset the connection. If you have a voice over IP system nowadays, putting a customer on hold triggers hold music. It's central to the system. As long as the device isn't just using a local hold where all it's doing on the device is basically muting the microphone for a minute, Putting a customer on hold and taking it off can reestablish the network connection and can sometimes seriously clear problems. It's as silly as it sounds. A next more extreme concept is to change the connection. If your system is more advanced, especially newer cloud systems, you may have the ability to do what's called call flip, which is literally take a call and move it from one device to another. In my actual scenario that I started this whole webinar out with, that was my solution. We had problems. I could not hear the person. We tried everything. What I did was I said, hold on. And I call flipped that call off of my desk phone over onto my cell phone, different network connection, and it worked perfectly. All of a sudden, it was clear as a bell, and everything worked. And in worst case, I know this doesn't, especially for talking about a contact center, but in the retail environment, it can be a pain in the store. The worst case, try transferring to another user. It's much better to say, hey, I recognize the problem and I'm not able to communicate with you. Let's get you to somebody who can, and move it to another phone, move it to another user so that you're proactively solving this particular problem. It's great to have all these things we've talked about so far that deal with the larger problems and bigger issues, but we want to solve each individual customer's problem. That's how we're going to get a great customer experience. Finally, make sure that part of the checklist and reporting procedures is always report the problems. Even if they fixed it, report what they did to fix it so that you have that data, and maybe you start noticing that there's a continuing problem with the equipment in place, with process or procedure or something else. Always report the problem, even if they fix it successfully using the checklist, so that you have the information and know what was done. So that's it. If you remember nothing else, bad voice quality equals poor customer experience, and you got to do something about it. If you're not addressing it, this is a problem that is a hidden hole in your whole great customer experience portfolio that you're probably trying to deal with today. You need to make sure of this. So we went over how we measure voice quality. We talked about the methods of addressing voice quality through infrastructure, monitoring, and procedure. And we went through all of those in detail. If you've still got questions and you aren't sure what to do, give us a contact. You can reach out to your existing account executive. They can get you started on voice quality monitoring. If you don't have an account executive today, contact vmarketing@vertical.com. We'll get you hooked up with somebody who can help you out and get you taken care of. We want to solve your problems. We want to make sure that you don't have poor quality and that you have a great customer call experience. So let's see if we've got questions here. Hold on, let me bring up our list. If you've got questions, once again, you can put them in the chat. So we've got a question about, do other phones in the industry support these standards? Some do, some don't. It's an iffy question. Everything that Vertical does, we make sure that we've got the standards built in and it's in the solution because we think it's a key portion of it. In some cases, the phone may be able to support it, but the vendor may not bother to provide it. And that could be a problem, and that could be an issue. You might have it. You might not. So it is something where it's a mix and match. It's an iffy situation. But Vertical provides that on every single platform we use and can provide support for it. If it's a premise-based system, we can add it on. If it's a cloud solution, we can show you how to access it. There's no doubt on that. Another question we've got is SLAs are important when there's troubleshooting. Have things changed going from the older world where we had analog and TDM devices and we're just directly to the carrier to the IP world? And certainly the answer is yes. Of course, things have changed. It's a great question. And one of them is, of course, things have gotten more complex. You have to consider what the SLA actually covers. I like to bang on Microsoft a little bit because they have a really terrible SLA. Their SLA basically says anything that's happening on any network you traverse that Microsoft doesn't control, that obviates the SLA and there's no value to it. And something like that means that there's no value to the SLA in a modern cloud world because most calls at some point are going to transit somebody else's network. And you need to have solutions that are going to overcome that and address that. When we do a cloud solution, the SLAs that we offer will say, hey, look, we're either going to provide you a connection to the last mile or we're going to provide you a way to have an SLA that's covered on that public internet connection. And we're going to support it. So you've got to think about the increased complexity. Another piece of this is you may need to have an SLA for that data pipe itself if the calls are going over. So there may need to be multiple stacked SLAs here. And that has to be something to consider. It's just the complexity of what's going on that has to be considered. But the key to all of this is you've got to have access to the data. If you don't have access to the voice quality reporting, if you don't have access to that information, how in the world are you going to prove the SLA has been violated? You're going to wait for the vendor to just call you up someday and say, oh, we messed up. We messed our SLA up. We're going to give you a credit. I find that unlikely. So you need to have access to the information yourself so you can enforce accountability. Great questions. Do we have others? If you're only on a voice link, it's okay to go ahead and ask the question out loud. That's all right. But otherwise, just type it in here and we can sit there and make sure and answer it. Sometimes typing can be hard, so I'll give everybody a minute. Don't feel too rushed. Just make sure and get it in there. And if you think of questions later on, don't hesitate to reach out to us. We want to hear your questions and discuss. That's what this is all about. Feel the better educated a customer is, the more likely that they are to do business with us. So we want to make sure you're as educated as possible on these topics. I always tell people it's okay to leave a little bit of silence so that you can let people think about it, have questions, or maybe there's somebody typing a dissertation of a question on here. Well, I think we're going to give you all back some time here. Hey, what more could you ask for? A little more time in your day. If you do have questions, once again, talk to your vertical account executive, or if you don't have one, reach out to vmarketing@vertical.com. We can get you somebody who can help you out. We hope this has been worthwhile for you today. We appreciate your time, and thanks for coming.